I'm kind of excited to like just see what comes of this conversation.
Yeah, me too.
Because we do this all the time. You know what I mean? We do this all the time, but like never in front of cameras. And
Right.
this is what spawned the 90-second cinema video idea.
Just endless phone calls of like, you know what movie I watched this week, and I hated it.
Yeah, yeah. Right? Let me tell you why this movie sucked. So
let's talk about this.
Draft 1.5.
Yeah.
Like this is our own term for what we're seeing in film
in
right
movies,
now. Like what do you describe? Can you put it into
So
words?
I would describe this as when you get a film, right, and it's solid. Like this is pretty decent, but like everything's kind of laid bare in terms of themes. Like it's all just like, they showed you the whole hand of cards. It's not nuanced. There's nothing really to read into. All the ideas, all the concepts, everything that the artist or director was intending to do, or the screenwriter, if you will, it's just there, and you don't have to go back to it because they basically told you up front what it is.
Yeah, and for those who aren't writers, those who haven't really written, very oftentimes when you write your first draft of the story, it's very, you are hitting the nail on the head.
Right, it's terrible.
Like, it's not good. It's not good, right? Yeah, it's not good.
It's not good.
You're beating your message to death. You know what I mean? You're like, okay, I want to make a film about anxiety, right? So now I have written a script, and every scene has to do with anxiety. Anxiety.
Exactly.
Every scene.
Yeah, every
and you're
scene's
like,
about that.
and you go back to these scripts, or people read your scripts, and they're like, oh, it's good, but what's going on? What's going on? Like, what's the story?
Yeah.
I get the message,
right?
But what's the story? So I feel like Draft 1.5 is what we're seeing, where you see the bare minimum of a propelling story, right? Of a story that's just basic, that's just barely getting you through
right
the message that
like,
the director is trying to tell you.
It's like, you got it, it's like you remember we watched that movie with Jesse Eisenberg, the
Vivarium.
Yeah. Remember we were just like, okay, obviously this movie is about domesticity and like moving to the suburbs and
from the first scene, from literally the first scene. So for those that haven't seen this movie, the film starts off with a scene of a cuckoo bird, which what it does is it basically lays its eggs in another bird's nest, and the cuckoo bird is raised by this other bird. So from that moment you're like, oh, I understand exactly what this film is going to be about. It's going to be about somebody raising an offspring that isn't theirs. Yeah. And what is the film about? It's about this couple that gets trapped in this scenario where they're raising a kid who's an alien. He's an alien or something like that. And the premise of that, the thing that kind of spurred us to talk about this topic, is that concept is so fucking cool.
Yeah, it's a great idea.
It's a great idea
for a movie. But at the end of the day, it's like if all you have is a good idea, and you're not going to really take the time to develop that into something that just transcends an idea, then it's like, what are you doing? You're wasting my time. You're wasting an hour and a half of someone's life by churning out this, and it's, for lack of a better term, it's almost like it feels almost lazy.
I think a lot of people could say that film recently has a very lazy approach to it, right? I don't think that's a hot take. You know what I mean? I don't think that's a hot take at all.
No, I have a lot of theories onto why this might be.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it ties back to this Draft 1.5 we're talking about, right? Where somebody has a great idea for a script. Let's make a movie about. I'll use a film that does work. I was like, Talk to Me, right?
Right, Talk to Me is great.
Film about a hand that gets you possessed by a demon. That movie had the potential to be bad, just to be a schlocky horror film about these kids that get possessed, and it turns into one of those James Wan-esque jump scare films, which, by the way, a lot of them are very good. So I'm not shitting on James Wan at all, but he's definitely created that type of style that a lot of people like to emulate, where they're like, okay, there's a demon, that's kind of lurking around, and every 5 minutes there's a jump scare. You know what I mean? It had the potential to be that, but it didn't become that because you feel like, okay, they didn't just write one draft, touch it up a little bit, and then film the movie. They wrote one draft, probably rewrote it multiple times, and they were like, okay, how do we tell the story of this woman who is dealing with trauma, who's dealing with the death of her mother, and is now trying to kind of acclimate back into society.
Right, and what I love about it, though, is it's, it does deal with things that are relevant. It deals with, teens using drugs, the desensitization that social media has had on teens, and then takes that, but it doesn't become the main point. It's just a part of the story. It's just woven into how these characters interact with this plastic hand that's going to unleash this horrible, horrible thing on them. It's like they become more careless because they are so desensitized. So it's relevant, but it's not making the whole thing about that. It's trying to just make a good movie, and then there's these things happen to be woven into the core concept of the movie.
Yeah, and both of us went to film school, right? Both of us went to film school, and both of us are guilty of doing the thing I'm about to describe, where maybe we get an idea and we say, oh, this film is going to be about teenagers dealing with the desensitization of social media, right?
Right.
And that ends up, what you would see in film school a lot is that's the film.
That's the whole thing.
That's the whole thing.
I remember I made a film about a breakup once, and this was one of my biggest failures during film school. It was a film about a breakup, and that was literally the whole thing. And now it's like I have it on Vimeo as it's locked down. You can't watch it. You're not gonna see it. It's so nothing, and it's like you see this a lot in film schools, and I think as to why this happens. Why does draft 1.5 happens? It happens because, for a lot of reasons. One, I think in particular, is the first thing we're going to talk about maybe, is the over-intellectualization of film that's come about through film schools, where it's like it's art, so you have to have an idea, you have to have a theme or a concept that's about something more than just, oh, a guy's going to grab a hand and it's going to make horrible things happen or whatever. It's like it has to be about something more than that.
It has to make the person feel something that they have never felt before, and it also has to be so unique that no one's ever seen it before.
Right. Inadvertently, what this is doing, though, is it's kind of instructing the newer generations that you can't just make a film. It has to be about something, but films are always about something, whether, it was intentional or not. A good example would be Memories of Murder, right, from Bong Joon-ho. Great film that deals with, it's a detective's trying to find a killer, right? But then what it's kind of saying politically about how the police were treating their citizens, or the cultural fear that was kind of going on in that particular era of Korea, that's all there. It makes it a really complex, almost political work of art. But at the end of the day, the script is just focused on this small-scale story set within that world.
Running with Bong Joon-ho a little bit here, because all his films are so politically charged, is that, you take a film like Parasite, right? Which literally won every award at the Oscars.
It won literally everything.
Everything.
Like, won absolute, just took them all.
Took them all. Yeah, it's crazy because, like, you remove the unique horror family dynamic aspect of that film, and it's just a film about class struggles.
Yeah,
right.
For sure.
I genuinely think that he's a talented enough artist where, when he was writing that film, or when that film was being written, there was a point in that first draft where they said, okay, maybe we're leaning too far into the class dynamics and we're not making this interesting enough for the audience, right? Yeah. So then what do? You go back to the characters, right? And you're like, okay, what's the family dynamic like? Are they kind of, quote unquote, parasites who, try to, maneuver their way into these more opportune situations and take things from other people, which we see them do very early on in the film, So then all of a sudden you're like, oh, wait a minute, I'm not focusing on the class struggles. I'm focusing on how interesting this
You're
family is.
You're engrossed in the story. You're engrossed in the storytelling and the filmmaking. And the characterization of all of them is fantastic, where it's like the family is great, and you can find things to like even about, the rich family. It's not black and white. It's like, I could totally see in the hands of a lesser filmmaker a version of that movie where it's like, the poor family is good and the rich family is bad. Instead, Bong Joon-ho kind of walks this line in the middle and says, maybe it's a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, maybe it's a little bit more complicated. The audience is still getting the message, though.
Yeah.
And say if an alien dropped to planet Earth and had no idea about the class division in any way, shape, or form, right?
Yeah.
Could say, that was pretty scary. That was interesting. Like, that family was kind of crazy how they, like...
It's kind of nuts.
Kind of nuts how they did that, you know what I mean? And I think that's what's missing with a lot of current films is that, for lack of a better term, if you drop an alien here, they wouldn't have the preconceived notion about ideas and topics or issues.
You could still enjoy the movie even without the ideas, like without understanding the social context that the movie exists within. You would at least get something out of it. And I feel like a lot of these movies today, they're so much about the social context that they exist in that they forget to, first and foremost, make a good movie. So, it kind of leads us to this whole predicament that we're in now, where it's like so many movies are like this. And again, I think it's this over intellectualization that we're seeing.
So I think like what's such an interesting predicament, or just an interesting like train of thought that I really haven't figured out for myself, maybe we can figure it out now, is that films today obviously have a very political, social message behind them, right? Like a lot of the times you go into the film and you have to be like, oh, this is talking about that news article I read about, right? Like the thing I saw on social media, this film is addressing that topic, right? But I would say that films from the late 60s and 70s did the same thing. So why do we return to films like Apocalypse Now, like Taxi Driver, like Midnight Cowboy, that are so rewatchable and so entertaining? And these films today don't necessarily have that same rewatch value, except for films like we're saying that work really well, like Parasite or like Talk to Me, that balance the political messaging and the entertainment value of the story so particularly well.
Yeah, and first and foremost, obviously, it's okay for a movie to have political undertones.
Oh, absolutely.
That's absolutely okay.
That's the point of art.
It's like it's inevitable. Mm-hmm. But the problem is when that's all you're saying, then you're not saying anything really other than the thing, and there's nothing else. But with those other movies that you mentioned, I think what makes them so rewatchable is, like we've said, they're so focused on characters. They're so driven by their stories that, like Taxi Driver, Travis Bickle's a fascinating character. Apocalypse Now is a really great example because that was very, very, on the nose, prevalent at the time. But the thing about that movie in particular, Apocalypse Now, is that we're experiencing the horrors of this war in a way that it puts it into context for people, because they had, up until that point, only been reading news articles, and then we see the actual effects on a human being. And I know it's cliche to consider Apocalypse Now to be very dreamlike, very nightmarish, if you will, but it's so lucid in terms of its film structure that it becomes something that transcends just being a political front, a political message. You're experiencing something that's truly and deeply cinematic because it is an assembly, a collage of sound and visual movement and light and narrative that's so compelling and horrific that how can you not look at it,
That's a really good point you just said. How can you not look at it? Like if we're taking in Apocalypse Now, like the Flight of the Valkyries scene, right? Where the bum 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 bum, the helicopters are coming on in. You're like, how the hell do I turn this movie off?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? How do I turn this movie off?
It's so bombastic. It's so cool.
It's so cool. And, there's that scene. Then there's scenes where, for instance, even the scene where where we're first introduced to Martin Sheen's character, and he's in the hotel room, right? And he's like talking to himself, but he's also like breaking the mirror glass, and he's got books everywhere. You're like, I don't want to turn this off because it's so visually interesting and it's intriguing, and it's almost like, in that particular moment, it's like, yes, there's a lot of commentary on what Vietnam did to the psyche of the American soldiers there. But Martin Sheen's character isn't saying, wow, Vietnam did so much to the psyche of the American soldiers that are there. You're seeing, you know what I mean?
We don't get like a whole hour after the movie ends of just like Martin Sheen walking around Texas or whatever, being like, wow, that war messed me up. And like if that movie were made today, right, we'd probably get that. We'd probably get that additional hour of just like, wow, that war sure messed me up.
That messed me up, man. Let me tell you something. Sitting in a scene, the classic art house scene you see in trailers where somebody's like yelling into a pillow. You know what I mean? You're like, oh, okay, all right, man. Like, we get it.
All right, this is what we're doing now.
Yeah. This is what we're doing. You know what I mean?
This is great.
But it's like, yeah, that movie was so interesting because, Martin Sheen could have said, wow, I saw a lot of shit in Vietnam. It was bad. It messed me up. Or he could be literally rambling about nonsense in his hotel room on his leave of absence.
It's all about subtext, really. Mm-hmm. It's about the things that are underneath what people are saying. And I mean, like, that's one of those things you learn in film school, but I don't think it's really driven home, is this idea of subtext. And and this is just a theory, right? Mm-hmm. But I kind of almost blame the laptop for this because nowadays, when it comes to writing a script, so you can just type away, and then someone will read it and be like, yeah, this is good, you might want to change this or that, whatever. But like, you can delete blocks of text, rewrite a few things, and then move things around. You're not committing to, like in the olden days. I personally still write with pencil and paper first, because then it's like I'm confronting everything I wrote when I finally go and choose to type it up. And I don't think that you engage the same way if you're just typing, your script. Mm-hmm. And I think this is part of why it comes down to like this sort of, as we talk about the draft 1.5, because it is literally draft 1.5.
Yeah, you're taking the words you wrote from the first draft. You open your final draft document. You have your draft number 1, version 1. Then you have your version 2 document, and you're just copy, paste. Oh, maybe they said, maybe my buddy said that the dialogue here is a little too long or something. So I copy and paste most of it, put it there, cut a little. You know what I mean? And like, you're not doing the artistry work of it. What you're doing is assembling a 90-page script that is shootable.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Yeah. And I think I agree with you. Like, I think if you're not engaging with the text, then the remnants of that first draft, like what we've been talking about, of like so heavy-handed with your messaging, it's impossible for it not to get carried over into that second draft, right? Because you're literally copying and pasting.
Yeah, all the problems that are fundamental in that rough draft are going to persist through every iteration. Mm-hmm. I remember, and I went to not just a film school, it was like an art school. Mm. I remember I had to take a class in graphic design. Mm. And one of the things that they taught you was you do 20, 30 thumbnails, do as many thumbnails as you can before you draw the final thing. Mm-hmm. Because the more you iterate, the more steps you take from going beginning to final, the odds are you'll probably have something much, much better by the end.
100%, yeah. I mean, my job right now, I mean, I'm working as a novel writer, and and constantly I'm always, I'm getting feedback of like, oh, this paragraph doesn't really work. This paragraph reads a little clunky, or this paragraph, maybe we can shorten it a little bit. And it's funny because I feel like if I was working by myself, right, if I was just doing my own thing, if I wasn't working for somebody who was hiring me, right, I'd almost be like, oh, yeah, this draft worked. Like, this worked. Like, that's a bad thing to say, though. It's like, oh, yeah, this worked.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Like, that's a bad thing to say. And, like, that's what I've learned a lot about, you know, getting this job and kind of growing as an artist is, like, you know, just saying, oh, this works. Like, it probably doesn't. You know what I mean? Like, it probably doesn't. You have to, like, look at it and say, like, okay, by the 4th time I rewrite this, then it'll be good.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Just writing it once and being like, yeah, I think this works. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. It's not there. It's not going to work.
I've been working on a personal short film. It's animated, and you know I've storyboarded the opening at least 4 or 5 times. No joke. And it wasn't until I started building environments, it's CG, until I started building environments and seeing elements in those environments that I started to figure out important bits of the story. So it's like this process of iteration where it's like, oh wow, I've storyboarded this 5 times. We should probably cut this because this is not going to make any sense.
No, you're good.
But I've storyboarded it like 4 or 5 times. And then,
I'm leaving this in. Yeah.
Oh God, I storyboarded it 4 or 5 times, and I was like, this kind of works, but it's not quite there. Then I finally built the environment, and it was environmental details that helped me figure out the missing bits of the story. It's like creating in a vacuum, where it's like if you create in a vacuum, you're not going to get anything other than what's
just
up
what's
here.
in your head. Yeah.
And oftentimes what's up here is pretty unrefined. If you try to draw a giraffe from memory, you're not going to get a very good giraffe.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay, and I think you're hitting on something here too that I want to talk about from film school as well, because I think in film school, or at least I think the new generation of filmmakers is being told, write your story, right? You have a story.
Yeah.
Make it unique to you. And while that is 100% valuable for people to tell their stories, what is going on up here though is it's not, I promise you, it's not as entertaining
your
as
life
you think
isn't
it is.
Entertaining.
Yeah, like it's not entertaining. You know what I mean? It's just not. Like, no matter who you are, unless you literally live even if you live the craziest fucking life on planet Earth, right? Even if you live the craziest life on planet Earth, if your movie is just about Dos Equis, the most interesting man in the world, right? And it's an hour and a half of that, it's not going to be very interesting. Like, what are the layers of it? What are you trying to say with the movie? It's
all about layers.
It's all about layers, man. It's like, okay, maybe the most interesting man in the world, I don't know, maybe he can't keep a relationship because he has to focus on being the most interesting man in the world or something.
And why does he want to be the most interesting man in the world? Is it because growing up he wasn't really validated?
Maybe
he was the middle child or something.
And those are all things that just add the layers to the story. So it's like, I think when people are being told, write your story, it's almost feeding this idea that my story is interesting. Sorry.
Not always true.
Not always true. Yeah, not always true. And there's definitely interesting elements of everybody's life, right?
It's just learning how to take those interesting moments and then recontextualize them into a script that's interesting, into a story that's interesting. It doesn't always have to be your personal story, like this happened to me on Tuesday. It could be, some story that might seem, and it might even seem unrelated to you at first. Maybe you don't even know how this connects to you. You just have an idea and you run with it. And then, the script is getting there and you realize, oh, this sort of connects to this one time when I was growing up.
That's such a good point, man. That's such a good point, because I remember, and it's like going to take the, in the comments, people will be like, here's the film bro fucking, here's the film bro fucking example. But like, just knowing like off the top of my head is like, I remember Quentin Tarantino said in Inglourious Bastards, when he started writing it, he was like, this is about men doing a secret mission in World War II. And what that film ends up becoming at its end is a much more complex commentary on how people view entertainment and cinema and how they relate to it and how it almost dehumanizes other people, but also, it also makes other people out to be heroes, and the power of the screen, right? So I guarantee you that Tarantino probably didn't start out thinking that, but his own view of the world, right? What he knows is how the screen influences people.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So again, it's just like you said, it's like, I think when people write something that's unique to you, it's not so much, here's a story about me, right? Here's what happened to me last Tuesday, what you're saying. It's here's a story about a boxer, right?
Right.
Okay, now how do you make that boxer unique to Ben?
Right.
You know what I mean? Like that it's coming from, that he's coming from Ben's pen.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? How you make it that he's coming from Luke's pen.
Yeah.
You know?
That's I mean, like you look at like for instance, Scorsese is a really good example. Where even when he's taking a story that isn't particularly his, he's adapting a book like Silence, and he still finds a way to relate to it. He finds something that's personal to him through it, whether it's his struggle through Catholicism or his struggle with addiction of some kind or another. It's like there's something there to make it personal. It doesn't always have to be, he's not a Jesuit who went to Japan and then had to deal with a bunch of samurai.
Yeah.
That never happened to Scorsese.
Yeah.
If you can believe it or not. He's not lived in feudal Japan.
Yeah.
But like the thing of it is even then, like just finding something that's, even if it seems unrelated, there's always some connective tissue.
So that's almost the better way. That's almost the thing that people should be getting taught. I feel like is not how do you tell a story that's unique to you, is how do you uniquely relate to this story?
Yeah, find what speaks to you and understand why it speaks to you, and then build on that.
So I think to kind of boil this all down is like to avoid draft 1.5, right? To avoid that moment that you write a story and you've hammered in so much of what you want to say that you've missed out on the story elements, right? To avoid that and to get that propulsion into your story, you have to think about the story first. Yeah. Right? You have to, it's like, it's a tale as old as time, right? But you have to think about the story first, because if you don't, you're going to wind up with that draft 1.5, where now you're just kind of throwing in random shit, like to try and make this interesting for you to peddle what you want to say.
For sure. And it's not just about, thinking about the story, but iterate. Because the more you iterate, the more time you spend going through variants, the more and more distance you put from that unrefined thought in your head. Because that unrefined thought, like I said, as I'm saying, is unrefined. It's rough around the edges. But the more you kind of get away from that, it not only becomes better and more polished, but it becomes more and more its own thing.